Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We are now just 15 days from the midterms, and both sides are extremely fired up. 72% of Democrats telling NBC News and the Wall Street Journal they have a high interest in the midterms, with Republicans close behind at 68%. While nobody knows what's going to happen, 50% of the likely voters say they prefer Democrats to control Congress after the midterms, compared to 41% who want Republicans to keep power. The biggest question now is who turns out to vote. Appearing in Nevada today, former President Obama warned of the consequences of staying home.
The stakes are high. The consequences of anybody here not turning out and doing everything you can to get your friends, neighbors, family to turn out, the consequences of you staying home would be profoundly dangerous to this country, to our democracy.
Already, more than 5 million earlier absentee votes have been cast nationwide. And in Texas today, on the first day of early voting, the turnout was, in the words of the Houston Chronicle, downright shocking, with thousands in line before a key early voting event even opened. Some very enthusiastic Beto O'Rourke supporters even camped out overnight to cast their early votes, earning a visit from the candidate himself for their trouble. Trump supporters were also camped out in Texas last night ahead of his rally tonight in Houston with Ted Cruz. This is a live shot of the rally, one of the 4 that Trump is holding this week alone. And while the president has been talking a big game in public about the midterms, in private, according to Politico, he is distancing himself from a potential GOP thumping, telling confidants that he doesn't see the midterms as a referendum on himself. And according to Carl Bernstein, he's also considering casting the results as illegitimate if the GOP loses.
I talked to people in the White House or in touch with the White House on Friday who believe that if the congressional midterms are very close and the Democrats were to win by 5 or 7 seats, that Trump is already talking about how to throw legal challenges into the courts, sow confusion, declare a victory, actually, and say that the election has been illegitimate.
Now, there's been a stark divide in the closing arguments for the 2 major parties. Democrats have embraced their record on health care, which polls show is the top issue for voters. Many Republicans have responded by misrepresenting their record, like candidates like Missouri's Josh Hawley, falsely suggesting they fought to ensure coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, when in fact they're on a lawsuit that would end it. If there was any doubt where the GOP truly stands, the Trump administration itself put it to rest today, releasing a new rule 2 weeks before the midterms to allow states to add plans which effectively do not cover pre-existing conditions. Trump and the GOP have also been working hard to inflame the Republican base, in part by spotlighting a caravan of desperate migrants traveling toward the U.S. border and falsely asserting it is full of criminals and terrorists and trying to infiltrate America, with the support of Democrats.
Are you thinking that as we watch this caravan make its way through Mexico, is this going to be a winning issue for your party?
I do think it's a winning issue, and I think the president's handling it perfectly.
There you go. Quiet part loud. A winning issue. Amazingly, as we get closer to Election Day, the lies are only being ratcheted up, both in intensity and frequency. I mean, Trump is taken to claiming at rallies that Democrats want to give free cars to unauthorized immigrants. Fact check false. And with polls showing that the GOP's tax cut for the rich and corporations remains remarkably unpopular, the president has been suggesting Congress will pass another tax cut before the midterms, even though that's literally impossible, since Congress won't be back in session until after the votes are cast.
We're giving a middle-income tax reduction of about 10%. We're doing it now for middle-income people. This is not for business. This is for middle.
Joining me now, Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, currently running for re-election in that state. And the president inventing out of thin air a 10% tax cut for the middle class between now and Election Day, apparently. What do you think of that?
Well, I just think he's talking and making it up, and nobody knows what he's talking about. But more to the point, it brings back to mind what McConnell and Ryan did when they jammed through the tax cut for the rich a year ago. More than 3/4 of all the benefits go to the richest 1%. And then McConnell said just recently, and this is the real key there, not only the tax cut go to the richest people in the country, but McConnell They usually wait till after the election to do this, but now he's saying what they're going to do, and that is that they're going to cut Medicare, cut or raise the eligibility age for Medicare and Social Security in order to pay for the tax cuts. So we cut taxes on the rich, and then we pay for it by the middle class, by the tab being stuck, by the cost being stuck on the middle class. And it's just what Republicans are doing now.
What do you tell people who say, well, the president says that's not going to happen, don't listen to Mitch McConnell?
Well, I think it's clear that the president's already saying we got to make cuts. And, you know, whether that's in my state, cuts to Lake Erie cleanup, or whether it's cuts in Medicaid. I was at St. Vincent Charity today in Cleveland, a hospital that does more to deal with opioid addiction than probably any place in the state. And they have told me if Medicaid is cut, that people will die. That the number of people, a couple of people around the table I was talking to said, and that they want to come back, they want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That means cutting Medicaid. They want to raise the eligibility age of Medicare. They want to cut Social Security. I mean, it's the same game they always play. Tax cuts for the rich, come back and stick it to the middle class. I urge people to come to my website, sherrodbrown.com, sign a petition saying no to these cuts from McConnell, because that's what they will try to do if they win the House and the Senate next year. And Trump, as he always does, goes along with the corporate Republican agenda every single time.
You know, one of the main issues in this race has been health care, and it's been, I think, undercovered at the national level. But every race you look at, your opponent is an incumbent congressman in the Republican Party, and Republicans swear they want to protect pre-existing conditions. Today, the White House itself issued guidance to states that will allow them to essentially allow for plans that skimp on coverage for pre-existing conditions, allow larger rates to be charged to those people. What is your feeling about how bedrock the Republican commitment to protecting people with pre-existing conditions actually is?
Well, it's all talk. I mean, every incumbent House member has voted, if they've been there more than 2 years, I believe, have voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act at least a dozen times. And that means they have voted to take away the consumer protections for pre-existing condition. They're giving the insurance companies the power to deny coverage. If they're incumbent senators, they voted the same way to allow the insurance companies to deny coverage. They can prattle all they want now and say in all the protest stations of, oh, we're going to preserve it. No, they aren't. They want to raise the eligibility age and cut on Medicare and Social Security, and they want to go after pre-existing condition consumer protections. They've already tried. We beat it back by 1 vote in the Senate. They will be back with more tax cuts that go overwhelmingly to the wealthy, and again, more undercutting the safety net. They don't like social insurance, Medicare, Social Security, unemployment. They live to do tax cuts, and they live to shred the social safety net. That's who they are as a party. I don't judge them morally. Well, maybe I do a little bit, but that is their political strategy. That's what they've done for 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years. They really never loved Medicare to begin with, and so we know that's their game plan. You can count on it. That's why we fight back. That's why Democrats are going to be successful in the midterms.
Final question: You're in a state that Trump carried by quite a few points, 7, 8 points, I think, just 2 years ago. You're running as an incumbent Democrat. You're polling ahead right now. I'm curious, what is the issue terrain you're hearing when you're talking to voters or when you're engaged in this race at the local level?
Well, voters know that they know that President Trump has followed the typical Republican corporatist agenda, except on trade, and I happen to agree with them mostly, although I wish he had done it a little differently, putting it mildly. But on everything else, he's followed the corporate agenda. More tax breaks for the rich, more bailout, more gifts to Wall Street, more standing up and giving away just everything, pro-drug company, pro-Wall Street, this whole agenda, this corporate agenda. Look who they're Supreme Court nominees. Both of them put a thumb on the scales of justice so that corporations win over workers, and Wall Street wins over consumers, and insurance companies win over patients. That's who they are. That's what they stand for. That's what's going to determine this election, and that's why Democrats are going to win.
All right, Senator Sherrod Brown, thanks for being with me.
Thanks. Always.
With me now for more on the midterms, I'm joined by former Hillary for America spokesperson Karen Finney, who's now senior advisor to Democrat Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial campaign in Georgia. Also with me, Democratic pollster Margie Omero, co-host of the podcast The Pollsters, and MSNBC political contributor Jason Johnson, politics editor at The Root. And Karen, let me start with you because I feel like there's this sense collectively that this is a test right now. The president has been lying with more zeal and frequency than even normal all day. I mean, inventing this 10% tax cut, the Democrats want to give people cars, the Democrats are behind the caravan, there's terrorists, all this stuff. And there's a real question of, like, is it going to work? And has everyone learned their lesson? Well, how do you see it from your perch?
You know, one of the things that I think is interesting about your poll is whereas we see maybe support for the president going up, we also see the enthusiasm on the side of Democrats continuing to be strong. We're seeing that when in some of these early vote numbers. So what that says to me is that people might be saying, I still like the guy, but I'm going to vote for Democrats. And so to that I say, you know, I think it's probably not going to work. It certainly seems like a sign of desperation on the part of Trump. And did you ever think you would say he's lying even more than usual? And what he's doing is what he always does, right, is he's not just lying, but he's also trying to have it both ways because he's saying, I mean, if we lose, it's not on me, but, you know, I'm going to come and save these people, except if they lose.
Well, and there's also, Margie, I mean, part of what has made this an unnerving situation to watch, I think a lot of people feel the stakes are very high. It's hard to follow the polling because it's complicated. There's a generic ballot. There's a bunch of individual races. But Nate Silver had this point, and I've been talking to pollsters just communicating via email, and they've all been saying this. We don't know how to model this electorate. We just don't. Nate's saying if polls underestimate Republicans by 2 to 3 points, a very normal-sized polling error, the House is a district-by-district nail-biter. If they underestimate Dems by 2 to 3 points, their path to victory in the Senate is much more viable. What don't we know about where we're headed right now, Margie?
Well, what we're asking polls to do is, and what we're asking voters to do is imagine a universe of people that doesn't exist yet. People don't know if they're going to vote. They are giving us their best estimate as to whether or not they're going to vote. So, and we can take them at their word. We can use other information. There's certainly internal polls and campaign polls that are different than some of the public national polls that look at turnout scores and turnout modeling. But that's based on past vote propensity. So these are, you take all of these estimates into account and look at the different range of turnout scenarios to see what the range of outcomes will look like. And then we have now early voting, which in some states is starting to look Democratic, and some states is actually a little bit more Republican. Is that a sign of where things end up, or is that just Election Day voters who are just voting early as opposed to an Election Day? Right. These are all questions we won't know the answer to yet. So that's why it's important to not just look at who's up +2 or what does the model say about this, but what are the issues that are driving voters? What are they thinking about? Well, what calculations are they making? Enthusiasm is one metric, but an enthusiastic voter's vote counts the same as someone who sort of reluctantly decided the day before to vote.
The grudging vote. And on on the issues space, I mean, it's so, Jason, it's so reminiscent to me of 2014 when Republicans obsessed about Ebola for about 4 weeks, completely cynically, including Donald Trump. He was driving it back in 2014. And then as soon as the midterms happened, they were like, oh, we're never talking about Ebola again. Because it was a convenient thing to inject a kind of reactionary mindset in their base. They're doing the same thing, it seems to me, here with the caravan.
Right. So there's this zombie apocalypse of people coming over from Mexico, and they're connected to ISIS and everything else like that, and they're magically going to disappear when Republicans, retake the House or keep the House. Chris, here's the thing that's very important to remember. Everyone is lying right now if they think they know what's happening, right? Now, we know Trump always lies, so that's a given. But these numbers, the universe, I can say as a political scientist, the universe that we're dealing with is just unseen. You look at Georgia, you look at Florida, you don't have to just look at this idea of, all right, the electorate may be different from 2010 and 2014. You also have to take into consideration what impact did Hurricane Michael have on early voting? What impact does voter suppression have on who's going to turn out and win? So what's really, really important, and I think what's been driving a lot of Democratic enthusiasm is people can't trust the polls right now, so they got to get out and vote. No one can sit on their laurels and say, I think we got this. And that's probably going to help Democrats slightly more than Republicans.
Karen.
Well, what I was going to say to that is, though, let me just say, let's be very clear. In this election, health care is a top issue. You were asking about what the issue landscape is. I mean, I will tell you that in the state of Georgia, where I'm working with Stacey Abrams, I mean, you have a majority of Republicans who want to expand Medicaid. So I think part of why
that is remarkable, by the way.
Right? And the polls, by the way, are asking the why, the what, but not the why. So a lot of what we're not understanding is, right? And so when you have Mitch McConnell, I mean, Sherrod Brown was so right, out there saying, hey, we're going to cut Social Security and Medicaid and these programs. People know that to some degree this election is about fundamental fairness. And part of the reason the Republicans are not running on the economy is that they know it has not trickled down to a lot of people who are still waiting for this infrastructure plan that was going to create these jobs. And so Trump has returned to his racist playbook, right? And I really do believe people get that this is fear-mongering at its best, and they're determined to turn out and say no.
You know, your point, Karen, to Margie, that point about Sherrod Brown's making this point, and this is his go-to point, and it's been effective for him in Ohio, which is basically there's no difference between this guy and Paul Ryan and McConnell and all the sort of like classic standard Republican tax cuts for the rich. Trump won, I think, in large part because he was able to convince people that wasn't the case. We'll protect pre-existing conditions, we'll expand health care. But in this race, that's a harder sell when you have a Republican Congress on the ballot that has the votes they have.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have the goods that people want. They don't have a position or a record that voters want. Their one accomplishment, the tax plan, it has become increasingly unpopular. We've seen in polls, and people, and a large number say they're not even sure how they feel about it. So they resulted to a base play, a Trump-inspired base play, which is not good. Not only is it not good for the country, it's not good for the long-term health of the Republican Party either, for that matter, or a very inauthentic, disingenuous view of their own record, as you were talking about with Hawley in Missouri and other candidates, and that's what is left. And voters are seeing through it. I mean, things like health care transcend party lines. I'm not surprised about what Karen's seeing, because everybody has health care challenges for themselves and their family.
But the question, Jason, is does reality out, right? I mean, the question is, can you look into a camera and say, I'm for protecting pre-existing conditions, even though I'm on a lawsuit to end it, and whether that gets enough people in the end to get them to vote for you?
Well, I think, Chris, the best indicator that the message of protecting health care and keeping the economy moving is helping for Democrats is because the Republicans have to keep changing their message, right? I'm old enough to remember a couple months ago, where the biggest problem facing the country was black guys kneeling at football games, right? The Republicans had to get rid of that because it's not working. Then they talked about the tax plan. It's not working. But Democrats have pretty much stayed on message. We're going to expand Medicaid expansion. We're going to make it easier for you to vote. We're going to make sure that we rein this guy in. And that's usually the only message you really have to have for a midterm.
Yeah, it's a good point. The fact that they want to make an election around this caravan that has occurred in the last few weeks, to me, does not bode great if that's like, you've got this thing in the last second that you're like, that's why we should go back and retain power. Karen Finney, Margie Omero, and Jason Johnson, thank you all for being with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.